Hello, this is Michael Rees. Welcome to Ad Hoc, a virtual talk series. I'm a sculptor and new media naut. I'm here to have fun and sharp conversations with some of the smartest people in art, technology, and sculpture. My interests and those of our guests will range far and wide and focus on making and the artist's role in our current era. We'll be talking to artists, curators, designers, and more. Welcome to Ad Hoc.
Hi, I'm Anna Ehrsam, Editor-in-Chief for Battery Journal, here with artist, educator, innovator Michael Rees and art historian Dr. Edward Shanken. We are discussing Michael Rees's exhibition, Synthetic Cells, Site and Parasite, which is on view at the Grounds for Sculpture by appointment through January 10th, 2021. I would like to thank the International Sculpture Center and the Grounds for Sculpture for their support and participation in this series. So hello, Michael, and hello, Edward. Welcome, welcome. I'm really looking forward to this beautiful, generative, great, and rich dialogue. Edward, I'll introduce you briefly. Edward Shanken writes and teaches about the entwinement of art, science, and technology with a focus on interdisciplinary practices involving new media. Recent publications include essays on art and shamanism, sound art and ecology, and bridging the gap between new media and contemporary art. Could you expand more on that? Tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned my new research on art and shamanism, and I became really interested in many years ago in the relationship between art and technology, which is something that no one really written about since the 70s. So as a graduate student in the 90s, working my PhD, I just discovered this wide open territory. And having worked in that area for a quarter of a century, I started looking at other forms of technology, ancient forms of technology, like shamanism, and realizing that these are really parallel kind of streams of technological invention that actually have practical real world impacts. So I'm really interested in the relationship. I've always been interested in the relationship between art and technology. And now I'm sort of expanding my conception of what technology is to include ancient but very potent forms of technology like shamanism. And I'm really interested in the relationship between art and digital technology and art and ancient technology and how artists are actually working fluidly between these fields.
Nice. That's very interesting, and we'll return to that. Michael Rees, will you give a brief introduction to who you are and what you've been up to, what you're up to currently?
Well, I'm a pandemic. I'm a pandemic draftsman. That's what I've been up to lately. I've been doing a lot of drawing, and kind of reconnecting to internal frequencies. But I'm really lucky that we're all here in part because of this exhibition that I did, Synthetic Cells, Site and Parasite. And Anna, you've got Battery Journal, and you've done the publishing work, and also we published this book. And so these conversations are a little bit about the book. And of course, I was lucky enough, Eddie was gracious enough to agree to write an essay for the book, which I really, really loved. And I was really touched by all the important points that, he brought. He not only paid close attention to the work, but he brought other things to the table and talked about other important things. Not the least of which he picked up on my sort of encapsulation of joy and added play to that. And that was actually a really important thing, because play, this exhibition, for example, came apart. Oftentimes what happens is an artist is in their studio, they're working, they make work. People come by, they say, we really love this work. I'd like that one, and that one, put it in the show. This exhibition happened sort of in real time in public. And I say in public, what I mean is that I worked with the curator and then I worked with other people, and it just kept coming together slowly but surely. And we never knew until it was finished what the final version would be. And so that notion of play that Eddie talks about in the essay is such an important part of the development of it, because you kind of put something out there, and then you also feel a kind of trepidation, like, oh boy, I've really done it now. Oh man, that's embarrassing. Oh, and that's play, right? Where you just throw something out, and it's speculative, it's generative, it enlarges the possibilities and enlarges the conversation. And I think Eddie really picked up on that in the essay.
I'd like to touch upon I'm sorry, do you want to respond? I'd like to touch upon the catalog essay that you wrote for this beautiful catalog for synthetic cell site and parasite. And this is a quote that you start your essay with, which is by Antonin Artaud. I really felt that you were breaking up the atmosphere around me, that you were clearing the way to allow me to advance, to provide room for an impossible space, for that in me which was as yet only potential, for a whole virtual germination which must be sucked into life by the space that offered itself. I have tried to get hold of things, to create within ourselves spaces for life, spaces which did not exist and which did not seem to belong in actual space. So that's Artaud, and you start this catalog essay off with this, and then you go on to say, the opportunity to see a new body of work by Michael Rees is cause for excitement, because there's a good chance that you will see something unlike anything that you ever have seen before. And in accordance with Artaud, who has been an enduring influence on the artist, Synthetic Cells offers the potential for a whole virtual germination, which did not exist and which did not seem to belong in actual space. So Rees's impossible space creates the possibility for serious play with the multiple valences of experience in ways that challenge conventional epistemological and ontological constructs, offering a glimpse into an alternative system of knowledge and ways of being. Can we unpack that a little bit? Because it's really beautifully put here.
Wait, did I write that? That
You
sounds
did.
really good.
You did write that.
I like that.
Gratefully.
It's really a great essay. It really is.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your really generous comments about the essay too.
Yeah.
I mean, I wish that I could say, oh, I uncovered that quote from Artaud and I just thought that was perfect, a way to introduce Michael Rees's synthetic cells. But Michael gave me the quote. I mean, I talked to him. We had a beautiful, long discussion. And I mean, he fed me a lot of the material in the essay. Some of it is definitely coming from me. But that's how I experienced the work. And I think the Artaud's quote really gets at this possibility of encountering a space that opens up new possibilities of experience. I mean, in that essay, I also go back to my first encounter of a solo exhibition by Michael Rees at the 303 Gallery, and gosh, that must have been, what, 1991? Something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was just blown away by it. I had never seen anything like it before. And the way the works kind of like amplified each other and created this kind of this impossible world of, it was very surrealist in many ways. And it also, I mean, Michael Rees's work is very much connected to the body. There are body parts that are always present. In that 303 show, there were casts of body parts that were assembled with monkeys. And I mean, it's like all these bizarre agglomerations of things that were so pregnant with meaning and created complex meanings through their connection with each other. And I felt really, I mean, synthetic cells is unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Um, and it's, I mean, I've been knowing Michael's work since 1988. So there's a long history of conversations with each other, of seeing the work evolve. And I remember seeing you, I guess this was maybe in the mid to late 90s. We ran into each other after many years. We had Indian food at Pana on 6th Street in the East Village.
And
And
your brother was there, wasn't he?
my brother was
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
who had also taught at Oberlin.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
you had started doing these, 3D printing works. And I was writing about art and technology. And it was like re-entering into a relationship and a dialogue where we had both, our paths had kind of separated for some years, and then they reconverged in a magical way.
Yeah,
And so, to see this work and this expansive work, I mean, Michael's been working with augmented reality and the combination of sculptural form and augmented reality for some years, um, as in that beautiful piece, Grave Bag, or in the piece that was on Broadway that I was so fortunate to see, a guided tour with Michael Rees driving by in his car.
yeah, that was
Seeing this, like
drive-by viewing.
this monumental sculpture with augmented reality. But these inflatable structures, wow, they just have a different sort of even though they're totally synthetic, they're like vinyl and all this, manufactured in China. They have an incredibly organic quality to them. So they bring back the body in a different way, and they call our body into relationship with them in a different way, because they have like these organ-like forms running through them. They're like breathing and have this systemic flow of different organs functioning together, maintaining homeostasis, this balance of air pressure and relationship. And the layering of these forms, and to see a whole room of these things suspended from the ceiling. I mean, I was just blown away by it. And then, to layer on top of that the augmented reality, and to have other artists invited to bring in different, perspectives. That's also kind of like the surrealistic, exquisite corpse, where you get a meaning that could not have come from any individual mind. I just thought it was a brilliant exhibition and so much fun. I mean, these inflatable structures, they bring back memories of beach balls. And for me as a historian, recollections of early inflatable structures by people like Jeffrey Shaw, which were also used with multimedia, projecting things onto these inflatable structures that people could inhabit. Or, so.
There's a beautiful quote by you once again, and then I'll open it up for Michael to respond to this, but it has everything to do with the body, and a little more description for the audience to really be able to understand physically what synthetic cells presents. At its architectonic core, synthetic cells consist of 7 pneumatic 10-foot plastic cubes. The alchemical element of air symbolizes both structure and consciousness, realization, both formation and abstraction, a fitting description of the work. Each cell is colorful and transparent, enabling us to see both the external and internal chambers. The internal chambers form apertures that meet the external surface, creating passages that meander through the cubes like intestines, blood vessels, synapses, and wormholes. They become portals for exploring the extension of our own organic vitality as we envision projecting ourselves into and beyond their space-time continuum. So that's really nice.
Mm.
It's you again. Edward, with you. So the bodily aspect of your work has been there since the early 90s, and I'm familiar with your history and your oeuvre, your body of work. And so the body, let's, can you address that in your work? And the performative element as well, I think is really relevant.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting issue, and it's such an interesting problem. Like, in some sense, somebody called me a figurative sculptor, and in some conversation or another. And I think that's actually true, but it's a slight, but figurative, usually you're looking at an object, right? In other words, you're looking at somebody's figure, somebody's masterful carving, somebody's, something like that. For me, the figure is present in multiple ways. It's present because you're inhabiting that space, but also because you're experiencing some object aspect of that figure. So obviously, for example, you project the idea that it might be organs and other kinds of things that are the bodily references there. But it's also a passage. They represent, or they evoke the sense of passage, and both passage on an internal system, like just a physical system passing air or passing any other thing, and then also on more internal ways, passages of thoughts and mind and various kinds of things like that. And then also implied in this, because of the other people's participants, is a passage to other places and other people and other things, right? And it's fascinating to me about art and how art becomes a performative process. And I think I did a lot of early performance art, and I did a lot of projects with performance art. And I think performance for me was always an embodied experience, was very much about the body in the same way, and very much about playing out the body and playing with the body. And the body was the subject and the aspect of the performance. But the thing that I want to kind of get to and talk about is that this notion of performative or projective, I got sick after I had done this exhibition. And I worked with a good friend of mine. I did some visualization exercises with a really, really dear friend of mine named Tammy Rodriguez. And she's very talented, and something happens when you're around her and we do those things. I mean, you really see things, the ajna chakra, which I've done works about, somehow stimulated in the maximum. And you almost have a waking dream. And I find these things extremely interesting because on the one hand, they're very hard to rationalize and talk about. And on the other hand, it's as real as any dream, or it's as real as reality and as real as any dream I've ever had. And so one of the things that happened in this visualization after I'd been diagnosed with my problem was a golden cell appeared. And the cell wasn't identical to the synthetic cells that were in the show, but it was almost as if the work primed the pump for me to have this experience of the cellular mechanism and all of its glory, input, output, processing, the mysteries of the cell. We try to understand it, we try to mechanize it, whatever, but it is still a very mysterious thing. We don't quite understand how proteins fold and unfold. And so I had a direct experience of my own work outside of my work. Now, I don't know if that's a crazy ass story or what, but the thing is that has something to do with the experience of why we make these kinds of things, why we bring these things together. We project and perform possibilities. Yeah. And then those possibilities somehow become real for us. Sure. This is I think I'm inspired a little bit by Eddie talking about art and shamanism, because that is the shamanic experience, right?
It's also the alchemical dream to turn base metal into gold. And you did that. You transformed your internal cells and your synthetic cells into gold through this this journey, this meditative journey.
Yeah.
Could you address what the inspiration for the project was more specifically? The inflatable cells. I know there's a really long tradition of these pneumatic structures. So
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Eddie writes about some of that stuff really beautifully, but I will say this, that one of the big, there were some technical reasons why it made a lot of sense to do an inflatable. And I always had it in the back of my mind that someday I would explore inflatables. And I think that anybody that knows me and knows my work knows that one of the things that really is valuable to me is that making art is an instrument of inquiry, right? It's a way to know things. It's a way to find things out. I'm always curious and always am led by my own curiosity. I wouldn't say exactly it's science but I'm inspired by that methodology. I have a question. Let's find out the answer to this question, et cetera. So, also at the same time, I'm always been interested in art history. And, there are artists that care about other artists and whatever. And then there are artists that really have an internal core and an internal vision, and they don't. I'm one that really loves and celebrates the history of art. And the history of art is always a part of the language of what I'm doing. And so there's no way that you can do inflatables without acknowledging the incredible work that was done before, like Jeffrey Shaw, for example, and the cinema experiences that he did, but also especially House Rucker, who were always a big inspiration for me. And I love the whole look of that utopian world, the bug's head things and the architectures that they created and they made. But also they coined this term sci-fi. Sci-fi typically is science fiction, SCI-FI. But in their case, it was PSY, PHY, right? So it was psychological physical, but not physical like body physical, but as in physics. So psychics and physics. And I just absolutely adored that construction. And as I went back to do research, because, the ground upon which these inflatables are done is pretty well trodden. It's one of the reasons that, we're kind of having a moment where a lot of people are doing it again, which, is kind of interesting. 60s, 2020s, utopia, various kinds of utopias floating around, new types of utopias floating around, which is also an important aspect of this work, the kind of collision of utopias. So I'm kind of doing something retro by reaching into the past and being inspired by somebody like House Rucker, but I'm also bringing it into this present where we really do we can get into it more deeply, but, through Facebook, Instagram, all these things, we really do have these bubbles that we're living within. And we also have a lot of conflict of utopias in a political sense, and I wanted to bring all these things together. And I'm a little bit I love the opera of it. I love the big, enormous, operatic aspect, which is why it made so much sense for me to invite these other artists to participate in this scenic, this stage set of an installation,
So,
so that's where some of the inspiration comes from. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the pneumatics, pneuma, the air in your work as a symbol of blood and breath, male, female energies, fluids, and consciousness. Seems like both of you.
I'll just say, I'll say, I don't want to dominate this, but I'll say a little thing about pneuma. And that is that originally I thought, and I'll call them pneuma, which I thought was brilliant, right? Because I knew that the Greek etymology, the etymology of the word pneuma, meaning breath or spirit, both simultaneously. And so, of course, I was smart enough to do a web search and just to see how pneuma's been used in various ways and, and stuff. And of course, I came across the brilliant work of Chico McMurtry. And Chico, and I don't know why I forgot that he had named all these pieces pneuma, and they're just gorgeous. I mean, if you don't know Chico, Chico's also, certainly one of those pioneering people that have really done some amazing stuff with robotics and with pneumatic structures and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, can't call it pneuma. Chico did pneuma. But at the same time, I don't think there's any question that I've worked a lot with pneumatic structures. I did something in the 80s where I had these breathing sculptures, which were automatic and enlarged and contracted according to the length of a long human breath, only around the presence of another human. And it's work that's not very well known. And, it was early work before I entered into the gallery scene or into any of those kinds of things. But I had already a long relationship with the idea of breath and sculpture filled with air and shape and form created through air or through processes. Eddie, I don't know if you want to expound a little bit on, because I think that you brought the Jeffrey Shaw awareness to me. Of course, I knew about Jeffrey, whatever, but you have a long history with Jeffrey Shaw, don't you? And writing about Jeffrey Shaw.
Yeah, I met Jeffrey in 1994. It was after my first year of my PhD program in art history. And I went to Europe and I got to work with Jeffrey at the ZKM. And I just did research for him and researched him and got to see his work, this beautiful piece called The Golden Calf, which was an early VR work using an early flat screen, handheld flat screen, similar to the interface that the audience in Synthetic Cells uses to access the augmented reality. And you would just see this thing and look at it, and all this, it was placed on a pedestal in the gallery space. You pick it up, and then you see the pedestal, and on top of the pedestal, you see this 3D model of a golden calf, which was like part of the object set in some library that Silicon Graphics provided.
Right.
So he found this golden calf and he thought, wow, this is great. And then you just sort of move around it and you could look at it and you could go into it. And there would be one of the things that had to be played with was the inside and the outside. But there is this spaciousness. There is this air inside this virtual object. So I love this piece. There was my first publication was a sort of review of this artwork. Yeah, he's just a really interesting artist. These inflatable structures, I got to meet some of his collaborators who worked with him on these things in the 60s and documented them. So yeah, I've been fascinated with that for a long time. It's that expanded cinema tradition that Jeffrey was such an interesting, played an interesting role with. But really, I want to go back to the body because one of the things I could have said, Anna, in response to your first question, what are you doing, is over a couple of years ago, I realized that I'd spent 25 years or more really focusing on refining and cultivating this left brain hyper-rational part of my way of making sense of information and communicating information analytically and I realized that I was really out of balance and that I really needed to get back more into my body, back more into my heart and integrate these parts of my being. I was very physical in my youth. I was athletic and that had just lain dormant. And I started dancing. I started doing ecstatic dance and contact improv and got deep into my body. And so for me, this part of my academic career has been, or I shouldn't even call it academic, this whole integration of life and scholarship and what I do personally and professionally. It's become so oriented to the body. And I see things differently. I have gained so much insight and wisdom through just being in my body and experiencing my body in space, experiencing my body in relation to other bodies in space at different distances, really close up. And I think that had I not really altered focus in my life to embodiment, losing my mind and regaining my body, I wouldn't have experienced synthetic cells the way I did. I would not have had the insight into that work that I did as a result of this research that I've been doing on embodied experience,
Yeah.
and how embodied experience is such a remarkable way of accessing consciousness, a sort of consciousness, an expanded consciousness that comes through a focus on phenomenological embodied experience. So I can get into that kind of mode when I encounter artworks. I can encounter them with my dancing body, with my musical body. And yeah, it's just, I think I have to give a lot of credit to that shift in focus in my approach to life and to what I do professionally for the sorts of insights that I gained into Rees's work. No,
Yeah, I think the point about the body is so important.
Oh,
because,
yeah.
you know, for example, in the early days of technology, you know, the Mac came out and we could do all kinds of graphics with them. I thought, I'm not interested in that. It has nothing physical about it. It's all happening in a virtual space. It's nothing physical. And the only time I started to get interested in the computer is when I realized that there could be a deep relationship between between what happened on the computer and the physical world. And as a sculptor, which I think is a very, you know, what does it mean to be a sculptor and all that stuff? It's very complicated because, you know, there's a long tradition, there are rich traditions, but certainly circumambulation around a work of art, to see it in dimensionality and to experience it in the body, is central to sculpture, central to sculpture. Yeah. I mean, and you know, there's a joke, it's what you bump into when you step back to look at a painting, but the painting is a fixed frame, it's a moment, it's a slice. It's never that dimensional, rich experience that is really truly embodied. In fact, you're projecting out from the body with a painting, whereas with a sculpture, you're actually also having you're having physical reactions with paintings too. I don't want to take anything away from that. But you know, you know, I was kind of driving at another point, which is that
it's a performative objects. And this leads me to my next question, which dovetails beautifully with this idea of having a full physical experience in your exhibition, in this installation, moving around these pieces, projecting your consciousness into these spaces, out of these spaces, and then into an AR or virtual space and inhabiting that space, and that being an incredibly rich experience that is authored, in fact, by the viewer. Edward, you were saying that you kind of had this ecstatic body experience in this space, and I witnessed people having just that in this space as they experience this. But so how does performance inform this particular work? You know, how are you engaging people in a performative way? And then also, this is a multiple part question, but also the theater of cruelty, maybe as an agitator, as a way of creating a rupture or break from some kind of continuum, space-time continuum, or you know, a normative kind of way of just being in the world, but you've created maybe a rupture, a space where people can have some kind of ecstatic experience. And please, just, what do you think about that?
Well, you know, there's something, you know, I feel like you know, sort of a big open territory in my work, that I always am working to open up. I mean, that's why the Artaud quote is so right on, so perfect, is the idea that that there's something beyond what we know. First of all, there's something beyond what we can formulate, what we can say, how we can put something together. And then there's something also, so that's some, we know more than we can say, that famous essay by Michael Polanyi, the tacit dimension, So there's something more than what we can say. And there's something we sense, something we know, something intuitively that is there. And I head off in a couple of different directions here. First of all, just, making a work of art is like collaborating. You are collaborating with all that is. Now, all right, that's a little bit large. I mean, I did collaborate with a guy in China who helped me make the pieces. I collaborated with Tom Moran, the curator, who helped me make the show. I collaborated with the other artists that were in the show. In many ways, Eddie and I collaborated through conversation. And so there's all these ways that I start connecting to people and things, and it's performative in those regards. But the other thing is that there is really an unabashed absurdity about this work, right? And a little bit, it's the hidden part of the work. It's like, why is it so absurd? Why is it so absurd? I mean, in a time when people are using their voice to make, social justice, people are using their voice for all kinds of other kinds of ways and means, really important, really valuable cultural moments. Why this absurdity? Why this recourse to absurdity? And I think that it has, first of all, it definitely is the performative part. For example, you come up with a work, you've got the tablet in hand, you train the camera onto the picture of the Chinese wall. That happens to be what it is. It's a pattern. And up comes a pig, and the pig is walking, bloop, bloop, bloop. And behind the pig is another pig walking around in a spiral. I call that pig mowing the lawn. But you can actually interact with the big pig, the first pig that you see. You can make that pig big, you can make it small. I mean, it's a little bit like the Geoffrey Shaw, except of course we're doing it interactively, right? You can pose a person in between the camera or this tablet and the object, and you can have the pig gnawing away at the person's head, kissing it or whatever. And people do all of those things. They take these instruments, especially children, because they're more open to it, but they take these instruments and they begin immediately to play with it and to have fun with it and then to compose scenes with it. And sometimes people take their cameras out and take pictures of the scenes that they've composed through the tablet, right? And so it really starts to engage. It's performative in the sense that that pig performs every time. The pig is a kind of it's a cinema of sorts because it's always moving regardless of how but then the pig is interacted with and then begins. And then, by the way, it creates up hierarchies too. The kids come and play. They're completely relaxed with the technology. They don't have any problem with anything there. And maybe somebody's hesitant. They don't know how it works. They want to watch somebody. And so now you have people watching other people perform, literally. The people interacting with the piece are performing while the other people are observing. And then the other people say, well, what the heck, I'll give it a try. And it becomes more like an instrument. The artwork becomes more like an instrument, something that provokes something that makes experience.
A catalyst. A catalyst.
Yeah. And then, of course, you can bounce from my piece to Chris Manzione's piece, to Tamiko Thiel's piece, to Will Pappenheim's piece, often on the same project. And you can see different vibes and different responses to this. So this extends the performative. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a theater in and of itself, but I did talk about it, the operatic. There is an opera here, absolutely. And, it's totally anti-Michael Fried, totally anti-Michael Fried. So
yeah, it's ultimately very theatrical.
Yeah, right.
It demands us to perform in relationship to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was something that was really apparent in this earlier Jeffrey Shaw piece from 1994, where the people who are doing this, they're having their experience, but they're creating an experience for the other people, watching them interact with and perform this piece. And the same with synthetic cells. Everyone in the space who is, experiencing it, we can see them through the sculptures. I mean, you create all these different layers of presence. In a way, it's also related to the large glass, Duchamp's large glass, because another transparent piece where you see through it and other people in the space become then part of the piece. I mean, Duchamp said the work of art is incomplete until the viewer makes it. And this parallels, theoretical investigations by Barthes and his notion of the readerly and the writerly text, and Eco also mid-century thinking about the role of the open work, right? So yeah, this performative aspect, this theatrical aspect of it is really key. And I think also, I mean, you and I talked about this, Michael, and I think I mentioned it in the essay also. I mean, you wanted to really intentionally move away from a kind of didactic, socially engaged, you know, and approach to art and just make it more fun. Just create an opportunity for play and joy to happen. That in itself is really, really valuable. And this kind of comes back to, this is sort of where my essay ends up. So I don't know if we want to jump the gun, but we can come back to it and, move around because there's plenty of room for joy.
Yeah, there's plenty of room. Yeah.
So I realized
go ahead, say it.
Ecstatic body, right? Ecstatic body in this
the
space.
ecstatic body. So I realized a few years ago, while I was, going through this thinking about 25 years of development left brain, blah, 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 I had set this intention for myself as a graduate student that my goal was to create and share knowledge. And I thought that was a really ennobling goal. And I felt really good about the trajectory, the journey that I was on, creating and sharing knowledge. And then I realized I had created and shared more knowledge than I'd ever dreamed of. And I wanted to do something more. That wasn't enough anymore. And I went back to my youth, my teens and 20s, where I'm not a religious person, but for me, being joyful was like a religion to me. That was my way of being pious. That way I didn't have the language. That was my way of living in gratitude. Just being joyful and allowing that joy to ripple through the universe and spreading joy. Just like creating and sharing knowledge, I was creating and sharing joy.
Well,
So I felt,
yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up because, really was the context of the show that I did that previous show, Clowntown, right on the verge of the election of 2016. And, it was very critical and it was very high drawer, very conceptual and all that sort of stuff. Similar to what you're talking about, very developed and maybe overdeveloped, et cetera. And I came to this work wanting, and I felt guilty about it sometimes too. It's like, God, the world's falling apart and all I'm creating joyous experiences at the, like, what am I, like fiddling while Rome burns? I'm certainly not Nero. I'm certainly not in charge of everything, but that's the metaphor. But my idea was that I really do believe that we have to start creating common experiences that are outside of the polemics that we have so subscribed to. And the only way I know to do that is through joy. And one of the things that I'll tell a little story, just a tiny little story. I saw this woman and her two children walking through the exhibition and they were experiencing everything. And I felt like they might have missed something. And so I saw them and I didn't want to interrupt them, but it seemed like a lull. And I said, oh, hey, by the way, I want to just point out to you that And all three of them turned and gave me this look like, excuse me, but you are intruding here. And I thought, oh my God, I have so done it, right? In other words, they were having their experience. They did not need any interpretation. They did not need any introduction. They did not need any intrusion. And that was a real lesson to me.
I
What
have,
a beautiful,
yeah.
I was just saying, what a beautiful and edifying lesson.
Yeah.
I mean, there you are trying to generously share something with them,
Yeah.
and you get kind of scolded, but that scolding is exactly the most beautiful thing they could have possibly done for you.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was a beautiful moment.
That leads me to this question about the idea of Kantian preservation, or the finitude of an object. So this really flies in the face of that. I mean, it's not about the object. Really, maybe the object is the catalyst, perhaps. But so, what is the being of the object?
The preservation of finitude, which is a beautiful idea, and like you say, it's Kant, but I think the object-oriented ontologists have really made it, especially Graham Harman, have really made a thing out of it, and made it into a bigger, not made it into a bigger thing, but really examined it, really opened it up, and I'm fascinated by it. I want to. This is kind of interesting point, and I'd love to hear what Eddie has to think about this too. And that is that I'm not a philosopher, and I'm also not a careful reader. Like, in other words, I don't go and read all of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology so that I can speak about it with authority. I'm a sculptor, and I have spent years and years and years of my life developing ideas and objects and techniques around that practice, right? And so I'm always looking to steal things, steal ideas, and so I was really intrigued by all the object-oriented ontology. I mean, it was all the rage, and people were really excited about it, and people brought it into their work. But I think it did a bunch of really important things that reverberate across culture as well. You see it in all kinds of places. And, also the Andy Chalmers article, What It's Like to Be a Bat, and also the idea of extended mind. These are all just so rich territories, such rich territories. And so the preservation of finitude is, I'll butcher it, but it's basically that, there's always an aspect of whatever it is we engage or wish to describe or interact with, which was always remote from us. Like as a sculptor, if I think about the concept of aluminum, I can use aluminum, I can bend aluminum, I can heat aluminum, I can cast aluminum. There's all these millions and millions of things I can do with aluminum. And aluminum, of course, is a construction, a sort of a engineering construction. Actually, I want to say it's a metaphysical construction, right? And I know that it's very physical on one level, but metaphysical on another. But the point is that there's always something about aluminum that is mysterious. In other words, that is withheld from me. As an artist, I mean, I think that we experience this as artists because sometimes you work and you work and you work on a piece and it's just dead. The material is not alive. Nothing about it is alive. There's no joy in it. You killed it. And every artist that's ever made anything knows that experience. And why? Why? Well, I feel like this aspect of preservation of finitude opens up the possibility of opens up possibilities in there. And the possibilities are, if we subscribe to panpsychism, which is the idea that matter is conscious, and a lot of people, even though it's got a very woo-woo side, a lot of very serious people are taking the theory very seriously. Panpsychism, that matter is conscious. I mean, I feel like as artists, boy, I really went to a place here, didn't I? From preservation of finitude to panpsychism. I don't know. I feel like these are territories that as artists we investigate. We open up, we look at it, and we have direct experience of. I have experience of material as a living entity. You know, now it didn't walk out of my studio. It didn't talk back to me in languages that I easily or readily understand. Or maybe I projected all of myself onto it, or, you know, in wanting it to be alive. Maybe it's a kind of anthropomorphism or something.
Or
But,
metaphysical.
well, I mean, I think the metaphysics is really, I think metaphysics is a really fascinating, you know, it was so denigrated for so long and so left out into the cold in modernism and, you know, materialist, you know, 20th century materialist existential philosophy. And yet, here it is again. It shows, you know, rears its beautiful, brilliant self. Eddie, I don't know, what do you think about all these things? I mean, you know, I'm kind of really curious.
Well, you know, I think this idea that consciousness pervades all things, all beings, whether they are alive or, you know, not alive. I mean, millions and millions of Buddhists believe this, right? This is fundamental to Buddhist philosophy. So it's really only in sort of, you know, to make gross distinctions of Western episteme that that's been dismissed. Um, so, I mean, in terms of your work, I mean, I feel, and I wrote about this, that there's something in your work that you say you're not a philosopher, but I'm you're not a philosopher in the traditional sense of writing philosophy for an audience of philosophers. And so I think that there's deep theoretical philosophical content in your work.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just not something that we can read with
And, you know, the
words.
thing I
It's
always say,
something that we, so where I'm going with this is getting back to the body,
yeah,
because I think we get that deep meaning. We experience it through our bodily, you know, multi-sensory, engaged, performative experience of the work. There are ideas in that work that are really profound about systems, about bodies, about alchemical relationships. And we experience them. They are, I think, embedded in the work.
yeah.
And then we reinvigorate them and bring them new life through our experiences of them, through our playing around with them, really playing with them. We have to play in order to really appreciate the work and go deeply into it and experience and know, gain the wisdom and the knowledge that's embedded in it,
Right.
the
But I
potentials
think it's an
of
interesting thing that
phenomenology.
you bring up, which is that in the sense of, you know, writing philosophy for philosophers and engaging arguments, I have no, you know, that's the point. I don't really have much interest in that. But what I'm interested in exactly is embodying or extending through the network of sculpture. That's sort of, you know, extending knowledge into these places, and knowledge that is only recoverable through experience. And by experience, I mean through the body,
Yeah,
right?
we
Through the
all
whole
have
body, not
bodies.
just through eyes, not through just, you know, through the whole body.
We all have bodies. We all know what our bodies are. We know how our bodies move in space. We know how we feel in relation to other bodies. And you activate that deep body knowledge, that deep body wisdom in the work. So we can relate to it in ways that we're not really necessarily conscious of intellectually, but we experience it and we gain that knowledge, that wisdom through our embodied experiences. There's this metonymic relationship between our body and the body of the sculptural object, through our body and moving in space, encountering it, grooving with the pad, and I mean, for me, it I mean, my analysis goes through all the alchemical elements
Mm.
because I think you activate all of them in the work. And, yeah, you activate all of those alchemical elements, and then you have this guided meditation where your cells become gold.
Yeah.
I mean, you create gold out of these elements, literally. And, well, maybe not literally, but experientially.
So, uh, this is a two-part question. The collision of utopias with the inflatable designs overlaid by the augmented reality. So why this idea of utopias? And then utopias in art history, that has a long tradition, failed utopias or promised utopias, the next utopia, but it really is no place, right? But in this piece, there is this collision. And how do you see this project in relationship to these failed utopias, or these utopian visions?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's such a big body of writing and thinking and whatever about utopias, utopia or heterotopias or dystopias. And, this is part of the metaphysics, right? This is part of the human thing, the ability to project models of what could be or what doesn't exist yet, or to imagine systems and do all these things. I mean, it seemed to make a lot of sense to me. First of all, because I did locate, the starting point where I decided I wanted to do inflatables. I knew I had an instinct for that. It wasn't a full-fledged concept yet. It was just an instinct to do that. And then I couldn't help but immediately think of, House Rucker and all that they did. And then that was a kind of utopia. And keep in mind that this is against the backdrop of the Whole Earth catalog and, all the stuff that was kind of going on. The ant farm and what they did with big inflatables and things like that. There was a kind of a spirit there, right? A kind of like, we're going to figure out a new way. We're going to find a new way. And I think that, I'm forgetting his name now, the Long Now guy who was part of the Whole Earth catalog. Does anybody remember his name?
Stuart Brand?
Stuart Brand, thank you. Thank you very much. Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand said that making houses out of plastic was the dumbest idea. So even when House Rucker was saying, we can make a whole plastic architecture and all this stuff, Stuart Brand was saying, come on, guys, get real. That's just a fanciful utopia. And so that was all, anything with this inflatable thing is embedded, completely embedded with the impossibility of it. The fact that it won't work, that it'll never be. I mean, there was that brilliant, beautiful 1968 World's Fair building from Japan. I forget the name of the architects, but that gorgeous inflated building that was raised. And that was also part of my imagination, part of that period, that 1960s period where anything was possible. The world was opening up, birth control and psychedelics and, cultural conflict and all that stuff. And now we're here in 2000, the period 2016 to 2020. Battling out many of those same social trends, many of the same difficulties, lots of utopias present. One primary utopia is the web and how the web came to be, But again, we're living, this is the kind of projective, speculative mechanism of the human mind. It's almost impossible for us to be without projecting something. I mean, it's very hard to be an absolute hardcore realist. And even being a hardcore realist is full of projection and speculation as well. So this, it touches something, it taps upon something. So the utopias, there's so many utopias in here, the utopias of the reference to the inflatables and inflatable architectures. The fact that you want to get into these pieces, you want to be in the passageway, you want to move through them, but you can't. And people are always a little frustrated, like, oh, I want to get in there. I want to get in there. And because the oculus, and that, just to say that kind of reminds me of, I think that's kind of germane here. it kind of references the sort of fourth dimensional models. You know, how we think of hypercubes and we can kind of imagine hypercubes, but we just never can get to the fourth dimension, you know? We just can never quite see it perfectly or sort of really understand what it is, let alone 5, 6, 7, 8. And so these pieces kind of reflect that n dimensionality, you know, that impossibility. And utopias are kind of like that too, right? The fourth dimension, we know that the fourth dimension is there. We can make math based upon it. We can use that math to solve practical problems, but we can never get to the fourth dimension. I mean, that is like almost the very definition of a kind of a utopia, a model that's out there that's inspiring and driving and pulls us, and yet at the same time we can't even sense it, feel it, or touch it. So these are fascinating things to think about. I probably went too big on that question, but
Great. That was really enjoyable to listen to your thoughts on that. Edward, do you have any thoughts about that? Yeah.
When you were talking about these n-dimensional spaces and the impossibility of really inhabiting them in a physical way.
yeah.
Yeah, but we can hint at them. We can create them metaphorically. And it reminds me of an essay that Marcus Novak wrote probably in the early 90s called Liquid Architectures of Cyberspace. And his work at that point was really focused in virtual environments. But I think that by augmenting actual physical space with virtual spaces, there is a heightened suggestion of hyperdimensional reality. And we can inhabit, I mean, we're there physically, in physical relationship with the object and objects. And we're also layering these augmented objects on the physical objects. And we're also playing with them in relationship to each other. So we are having really a heightened experience of multidimensional reality.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, we're not inhabiting fourth dimension or fifth dimension, but we're having an experience that expands the dimensionality of our experience. So, but then we get the interplay of these things. And I think that it's not something that, it's not written philosophy again. It's art engaging multiple ideas and multiple experiences simultaneously that enable us to have an encounter unlike anything else we could ever have. We could not read about it. It exceeds the possibilities of philosophy as a written discourse for philosophers.
You know, Eddie, I think that's really interesting. You brought up the multidimensionality, you know, and I think augmented reality, again, technologies are strange. I think maybe Heidegger said something about, learning philosophy through technology in a funny kind of way. Augmented reality is the realization of a bunch of ideas, but then it also offers ideas as well. And the realization is this notion of the portal that everybody, you see it all over science fiction. You see it all over, and yet at the same time, like say John Craig Freeman, whose work is in the show, you can, he has these sort of failed, these moments of grief and loss, these environments that he's scanned, some of them in China, some of them in America, etc. And you literally can see these laid over the sculptures, and you're taken to this place, and you're left wondering, you're left with an experience of something. It's not a full experience. In other words, we're not seeing everybody, everything. You're not smelling the air. But you are having maybe a synecdochal or certainly some metaphorical aspect of experience of this other space. And it's coming to you through this portal of the AR. And so this notion of multidimensionality, it's fascinating, right? Because there are so many different values that we can enter into. Now, certainly this is what a book does. A book, you read a book, it takes you to a time, it takes you to a place. It's beyond time and place. It does all kinds. I mean, these are kind of fascinating constructions. But now all of a sudden we're not having a textual experience. We're having a visual experience, and in some cases oral experience. And of course, you could say, well, that's just an extension of film. And yes, of course it is an extension of film. But the idea that multiple settings are available through the same portal is different than film, right? You see the film, the gateway of the film is the proscenium arch, right? It's right there in front of you. The gateway here is the tablet, but the tablet can connect to multiple films simultaneously. There's a multi-dimensionality inherent in that experience that's pretty
So
fascinating.
let me introduce this idea because you're talking about it, but I wanted to just state it kind of writ large. So you referred to this show as Sight and Parasite. So the cells are hosting 6 other artists. So 6 other artists that are making augmented reality scenarios for you that are overlaid.
Yeah,
So that idea, but coupled with the idea of Chautauqua, we pull those two together. The idea of this movement that brought together artists and scientists and some political and educational opportunities and technology. And this piece really draws in all of these ideas and influences and people as a site, a host body, and then the parasite.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, Parasite, I debated, Parasite was something, Will Pappenheimer and I, Will is in the show, and Will was very instrumental on a couple of different levels in making, bringing Ed Winkleman and Marat Razbakov into the exhibition to curate the Parasite part of the exhibition. He and I talked a lot about this, and Parasite is an active metaphor for what happens with augmented reality. And I think a lot of AR artists are engaged with that idea of the parasitic and whatever, because everything is a trigger for a code, another code that could take place with augmented reality. But Will and I talked a lot about the parasitic thing. And, para is, it of course has some negative connotations. Parasites are usually unwelcome guests in a body and usually feed off the body and often to the detriment of the host. But if you go back again to the original etymology of the word para, it means alongside of, next to, within. And so it's a completely appropriate aspect that you have, not only you have the site of the sculptures, but you have the parasite alongside of, next to, within, sites of other people and other places happening simultaneously within. And, it's a biological metaphor, and I think it's completely apt. And, computers and computer engineers and digital media in our culture has done a fabulous job at a kind of biomimicry by always drawing upon and using the way, the way nature works, taking inspiration and taking ideas from nature and how nature operates. And I think that, I'm inspired by that as well. I think digital media allowed me, or allows me, to engage in that similar kind of expansion. By seeing, once back, we're getting back to the figure, we're back to the body hosting all kinds of, you talk about your own body and how much is bacteria, how much is a virus, how much is, it's like when we get down to just what's little me, it's not very much. There's a lot more. I'm keeping a lot of things alive, as we all are, things on our, and so I love the idea of a work of art that would be so expansive and engaging in the same way, and would reference the nature of biology and the nature of the organic, the organic body, so yeah, I think I said it.
Yeah, I was thinking that when we go to the movies, for example, or when we read a novel, we have been acculturated into and have the expectation that we are going to um, suspend our disbelief and surrender to the the unfolding action, identifying with the protagonist. And so we give up, we willingly give up our sense of the physical space that we're in order to have as rewarding experience of the artificial space that's been created by the art, by the film or uh, the novel. I think it's really different when we experience site parasite because we never surrender our disbelief. We are always aware of the physical environment we are in because that is so dominant and because the screen is so small and because we are manipulating the screen. So we're never drawn into this fantasy of, the auteur, and that the univocality of the auteur is disrupted by the six other artists that are involved in creating these different augmented layers. So there is, first of all, there's no single linear narrative, or even no single nonlinear narrative. There is just a field of possibilities. And we are always very conscious of the physical environment we're in and the objects in it, which are the object of our attention. And our attention is shifting between those physical objects and the augmented reality experiences and the layering of the two together as we're moving and performing, in an embodied way through the space. So, yeah, it's really a very, very different kind of experience than film or cinema or reading a novel. And it's really different than looking at a painting where, we can also sort of like melt into it. I mean, you look at a Rothko painting. I mean, it's an invitation to merge into this, or the painting behind you, Anna. It's like, oh, I just want to like melt into that space, become one with that space. This is not that. We're engaged in it deeply, but we're always in physical bodily relationship to it. We never lose ourselves in it. We're always acting in it, performing in it,
Very active,
playing in it.
very active space of experiencing. She, do you have something to say about that? I have another question that really links beautifully to this.
When I first started working with AR, I realized, it wasn't like film. In the beginning days when, Thomas Edison would show his films, he had that famous one where the train was coming right at the audience. And the audience dove out of the way because they were unsure about what was going on. It really was a phantasmagoria that they took to be real. And with this particular media, there is never, and Eddie, this is to your point about the suspension of disbelief. There isn't a point where you suspend disbelief. You are always completely aware that you are engaged with a media and that media is constructed, right? It's, sort of flat up against you, right? You know various things about it. And I find that experience in and of itself to be one of the most interesting aspects of using that technology. And it has great implications for how we might be able, how we might be able to imagine ourselves, right? I think that's what's at stake. So I think your point is an excellent one.
Will you talk about, oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add to that because I wanted to bring that into the discussion about the utopian modernist and the, something else.
Yeah.
Because I think that sense of melting into a, you know, in a oneness with the medium, that's kind of a utopian modernist ideology.
Yeah.
And you're referencing that, but you're offering something very different than
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Something that has its own utopian possibilities,
That's
but a different set of utopian possibilities.
That's right.
So Michael, you say my ideal scenario, speaking of utopian possibilities, this is your quote, my ideal scenario with the viewer is that we will look together into the theater of an invented space to experience interactive and cumulative experiences of form and media as both object and network. This is
Yeah, I mean that's sort of yeah, that hints at what we're talking about, you know. I also think that, you know, I think it's interesting to note too that I think that these sculptures in essence do a bunch of things. And one thing for sure is that they create a platform that previously has been unexplored, you know, this platform of object, image, and interaction. But I also think the other thing it does is that it enacts network. And Eddie, you know, you've written, not written, but you were the editor of that Whitechapel book about systems, right? And it's like, you know, the point is, I'm sort of taking your question, Anna, I'm going off in a different direction with it. And because I'm picking up on the network part, right? And the fact that these sculptures engage, first of all, they engage social aspects because of all the people that are involved, all the ways that they're involved, all the interactivity that's involved, all the way the viewers engage them, etc. But also this notion that some aspect, it's a limited network, it's not an endless network, but the limited network of all the other artists that participated and the ability to reach them through augmented reality, right? And so that is, and so as Eddie said beautifully and brilliantly, it's an offering of possibilities as opposed to a construction of a narrative you should experience, do you know? And that is like a really, I think that's a different mode of making work. You know, it is for me anyway. It's a different, yeah. So I don't know what you guys.
totally expansive. It's totally expansive. It's as you were saying, Edward, it's not at all didactic. It's networked and absolutely inclusive. Um, and it goes to another question I had about relational aesthetics. These things all exist in relation to each other, in relation to culture and politics and all of the individuals that come to view the work. And each one of them is authoring the work in their own way. So it has this incredibly beautiful way of continuing to open up, I think. And even in the way it invites such rich discourse with all of us here talking about it. It really, I think it is a new form, and in advancing this idea that it is a new form because you're using different technologies and in fact had to invent new ways of working with these pneumatics. And let's talk about technology in art and really be specifically about how perhaps this body of work, this exhibition, installation, comprised of discrete elements, in fact, but because they are discrete elements that together comprise this installation and experiential, performative body. How does technology in art and how does this project advance the language of technology and of sculpture or art? And maybe, Edward, in a historical sense, we could talk about that and talk about in real physical ways how it might do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've been talking about that.
Yeah.
So just to rehearse some of the points that we've made with respect to that question that kind of asked the question in a different, direct way.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think, as I was just saying, that the references to historical, modernist, artistic, architectural utopias is there, but it's it's questioned and it's pushed in other directions by layering different elements together, by uh, joining the pneumatic space with the augmented space, by making the audience kind of float and hover and modulate between the two and join the two together in their experience. And that's, I mean, Reese's work has done that with other, layering of augmented reality onto physical objects. But I think that the quality of these particular inflatable objects as translucent inflatable structures that allow us to see through them, that include us in them, even though we're excluded from entering into them physically. They draw us in metonymically. We travel, we projectively travel through them. So we're having this projective physical traveling experience as well as an embodied physical experience in the space with these physical objects, and the augmented reality experience layered on top of that, and all of that together. I mean, I think it just draws together technological media in in new combinations that I think really do afford a different type of experience. It expands not just the language of art and technology, but the the actual experience that the viewer can have of the work.
Well, the technology thing is always, it's a bit of a bugaboo. Eddie, you know this as well as anybody does. Well, I mean, it's embedded in the history of technology and the art, the 1968 software show at the Jewish Museum, and how so many
1970.
vital, sorry, 67 was it? Sorry.
1970.
70. Oh man, I'm getting everything wrong today. Sorry. But the vital ideas that came out of there, conceptual art and all kinds of other things. And of course, the technology was not up to snuff at that particular time. So many of the exhibits didn't work, and there were all these problems. And the art world just sort of like turned its back in that moment, almost never to return, right? Almost, I say. And the problem, of course, with technology is that when you say technology, people are very mistrusting of it, et cetera. They go through all these levels of it. They did it with photography, they did it with video, until artists come along and somehow capture the imagination, and really make it vivid for people. I mean, the problem with working with technology and art is that oftentimes the art is an extension or an example or an almost like a test case for the technology. It's art that expresses the technology. It doesn't express anything about art or about the human experience. And, I think that artists make that. I made that mistake certainly in my life. I talked a lot about technology, and because the tool isn't neutral. The tool offers all kinds of things. But the interesting thing is no one ever wants to. I mean, there's an ironic bunch of issues here because people love to hear painters talk about painting. They love it. I mean, you hear Philip Guston go on and on about painting, or even, in more contemporary sense, David Humphrey in his interviews and stuff like that. People love to listen to people talk about painting. But somehow when it comes to computers, no one wants to ever hear anybody talk about technology. And I'm okay with it, because really that is a great definer for me, because it reminds me once again, this isn't about the technology. It's about the experience that we have. And it's about the metaphysical value structure that I have tried to create and tried to manifest, and then I've invited other people to inhabit. right? That is really what it's about. I mean, in the catalog, I put a work that I did in 1970 something that is a bar of earth with a TV on it. And you know, not particularly a great work of art or anything like that. But one of the reasons I put it there is I couldn't believe that in 1970 something, I had anticipated all this work that I was going to do with augmented reality, which didn't even exist yet. I mean, in some ways you could say a TV is an augmented, but you know, and I just think it's interesting. We invent the tools we need to say the things that are appropriate for this moment. And we've been doing it forever. You know, this is what we do as humans.
Yeah.
It's not much different than, you know, Leonardo grinding pigments and experimenting with different ways of making paintings.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to add something to this, and I think that part of the problem about much of the ways I've heard artists talk about their work using technological media is that it goes into so much depth about how it works. A painter never talks about how the painting works. It's like, you don't talk about how the paint works. You don't get into the molecular structure of pigment. You don't do that. You talk about it in metaphysical terms, about gesture and flow and moving the paint and, you know,
Oh,
the feeling, the experience of going, you know, working with the material, the feedback with the paint and the canvas, and the, you know, something emerges through that process of creation, and it's so romantic. And, you know, the artist is like this shaman, you know, bringing life to materials through painting. And I think that if artists working with digital electronic media would not talk about how it fucking works. I mean, who cares,
Yeah.
really?
That's it.
Unless you're
There it is.
right.
Who cares?
unless,
Who cares?
unless you're an artist who's working with technological media, no one else cares.
No one cares.
It's like, what is the idea behind it?
Yeah. Right.
What was the experience like of bringing this into being? What sort of experience do you want your audience to have? Where's the emotion? Where's the, you know, the connectivity to a larger field of consciousness? That's, you know, if artists working with digital media would talk about their work like Philip Guston talks about painting,
Yeah, that's
it
right.
would, people would respond so much better to the work, I think.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And technology for many people is still very, even though we live in it, we dip in it, it is the embedding space of our lives now. You know, it's overwhelming and people don't understand it very well. And you know, they don't understand how it works or why it works. And that's all well and good. But, you know, Eddie, I want to say that I want to cite a precursor for me for using the material characteristics as part of the structure of a work of art, but you know, part of the emotional structure of work of art. It was an artist named Fred Thurs. Do either of you know Fred Thurs?
You've mentioned him to me.
Yeah, and he painted. I mean, he's better known in Europe than he is in the United States, but he painted with vermilion. And his mother was a scientist, a color scientist, and I think his father was a chemist, or I might be getting some of that wrong. I've gotten so many other things wrong today. I'm sure I got that wrong. But you know, he used vermilion because of its molecular structure, and so he had a whole story about the molecular structure, and I found it innovating and exciting, and there was a research component, right? In other words, using art as a tool to understand the world we live in, and then to use those elements to an expressive purpose. And that is what Fred did. And if you look at those paintings, they're gorgeous, monochromatic, gestural. He used encaustic, you know, and when you stand in front of them, you cannot call the color because it's constantly shifting and changing. And, you know, because of vermilion, because that is the way vermilion works. You see an orange, but it also has another color because of the mercury sulfide chemical. Anyway, see, there I go. I'm geeking out. I'm geeking out with the painters.
No, and there are definitely painters that are interested in that kind of chemistry.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Oh, I have maybe one more question. This is a big overarching question. So determinant is an interesting method used to disrupt culture. How can art help to shape culture in maybe alternative and progressive ways?
Can you ask that question again, please?
Yeah. So détournement or détournement is an interesting method used to disrupt culture. How can art help to shape culture in alternative ways or progressive ways or shape it? How can art serve that function?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think art just, it's a kind of a not a very good answer that I would say, but I think that it's just what art does. You see it happening all the time. You see people picking it up and using it to advance all kinds of ideas. And, you know, what's always kind of interesting and amazing is that artists are often at the beginning of ideas that big media, big culture, I mean that with, you know, money and capitalization and all this sort of stuff, pick up later. They don't quite get it. Artists seem to be able to put their finger on things like that.
I mean, Marshall McLuhan thought of artists as the radar of society, and Jack Burnham, the art critic, art historian, who was also an artist who went to Yale, um, he talked about art as a psychic dress rehearsal for the future.
Mhm.
And I really love these ideas. I mean, for me, that's what I'm most interested in art. How is art giving us in the present a glimpse of what may come to be? How is it envisioning alternative futures so that we can taste them now and maybe fashion those futures as we, you know, build the world around us? So, I mean, as art students learn about this stuff, they become, you know, art directors and ad
Yeah.
agencies. And these things become part of popular culture. And they spread out in unimaginable ways that were unimaginable to the artists. But I think you're really right, Anna, that, you know, Matthew Barney, these other artists, as radar of our times, in tune with the subtle shifts and subtle changes, particularly with respect to technology, are the ones who are able to put that sensitivity, that insight into some sort of concrete form where it resonates in really kind of magical ways. And then, you know, ultimately, if it's really, you know, really cool and really visionary, it gets to, oh gosh, what's it called? Accidental audiences. This is a term that Brad Trammell writes about, the accidental audience. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how being the receiver, being the conduit, puts something out and then it's good. It goes through the network. We are in a networked consciousness. And yeah, it's really, really amazing to see how that happens. I mean, another artist I think of with this is Roy Ascot, who began working with computer networking around 1980, seeing computer networking as an artistic medium and doing works that really were participatory culture, network culture, collective, collaborative, performative, bringing into being of some sort of global consciousness of, you know, between artists in, you know, 6 different locations, or no, 12 different locations around the world. So, I mean, that's the reality we live in now. But this was an alternative vision of a future that Ascot imagined and brought into being. and then wrote about. Now it's like, it's so mundane. We're having this Zoom conference. It's
Yeah,
like we push a button, it's no big deal.
yeah, yeah,
Back then it was limited to ASCII text.
yeah.
But still, the feeling of connectivity, of this collective consciousness that emerged among the participants around the world, was so powerful.
Yeah, like the other example of that is Frank Gillette, and he was an early internet user. I think a DARPA net user. They gave him a big phone. He went up on a mountain. He did stuff. And I remember being at the Kansas City Art Institute in probably somewhere around 1981 or 82, maybe a little earlier. And Frank came to campus and he talked about this whole thing, and he went into it in great length. And I remembered practically, verbatim, and years later met Frank and said, "Oh, Frank, I remember," and the point is that this is the world we live in now. And it's mundane. It is absolutely the wallpaper of our time. Whereas at that point, it was extraordinary and far-fetched and impossible. And yet here we are. It's the wallpaper of our day.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you read Frank's writings in Radical Software, they are so visionary.
Yeah,
He was so,
yeah,
so brilliant.
yeah. Yeah. I always thought that. It's hard to get a hold of his writings. He's written a lot, and oftentimes he just keeps it to himself. So yeah, beautiful.
Well, anything else?
Well, Anna, I just want to thank you for putting your effort and time into this and creating those questions. And Eddie, of course, I'm very grateful to you for the beautiful essay that you wrote for the book. It really meant a lot to me. And I think that, hopefully we've made something that people will really enjoy and will have some reverberation.